Okay, this week's lab, we need to get back to where we were at the end of last week's lab, so you need to reconfigure the inner VLAN routing config we had last week. And then once you get that done, we are going to configure the router for a DHCP server, and we will first use it to give out an IP address to our Windows PC that's in VLAN 2. Once we get that working, then we are going to move on to the next step of the lab, which is to configure the Linux machine for a DHCP server. So the first thing we're going to do is configure it to give out IP addresses in its own subnet or VLAN, and we'll move the Windows PC into the extra VLAN 3 port we created. So once we get the Linux box configured for a DHCP server, we'll move the Windows machine over, and then we'll release and renew our IP address, and our Windows machine should get an IP from the Linux box. If that's not working as expected, you might need to disable the DHCP server on the router, which might be a good idea to do that anyway before you move on to the Linux part. Once you get the Linux box giving out IP addresses to the Windows machine in VLAN 3, then we're going to move the Windows PC back to VLAN 2, and we're going to configure our Linux machine to give out IP addresses for VLAN 2 by creating a second scope in the DHCP server config. And then we're going to configure our router to forward DHCP requests that it receives to the Linux server. So basically in this configuration, the Windows machine is going to send a broadcast request saying, hey, I need a DHCP address. The router is going to hear that on that sub-interface for that VLAN and be like, oh, hey, I know what to do with that, and send that request over to the Linux machine. And then the Linux machine will respond with an IP address that the Windows machine will get and be able to configure for VLAN 2. So that's the second part of the Linux DHCP server config. There's another part we're doing where we are going to get the MAC address of the Windows machine and put it specifically in the DHCP server config to give out a specific IP address to the Windows machine. This is called a DHCP reservation, and there are times when you want a host to get an IP from DHCP, but you want to specify what IP it gets, so it gets the same IP address every time. So we're going to explore that on the Linux machine. Once we finish that, then we're going to move on to the DNS portion of the lab. You're going to configure your Linux machine as a DNS server. There's some sample files in Desire to Learn you can download, get that service running, and then you're going to use NSLookup to verify that the DNS server is working properly. And then we're going to put some specific records in there, and you're going to access your web server from last week. Remember last week we set up a web server, so you'll need to restart your web server, and we're going to access that web server from your Windows machine by domain name. So a couple different things involved in that. One, you need to make sure your Windows machine is now pointing to your Linux machine for DNS. Initially, you put in my DNS server for DNS in the DHCP part, so you'll need to change that so that your Windows machine is pointing to your Linux machine. And once you have your Windows machine pointing to your Linux machine for DNS, you have your Linux machine working properly as a DNS server, and you have an entry for your web server on your Linux DNS server, and your web server is running, then you should be able to use the browser to get to the web page on your Linux machine. So then the last thing we're going to do, I think it's the last thing we're going to do, is we're going to set it up so that you can access your web server from the outside, and by the outside I mean from the RichNet. So in that case, what you need to do is you need to change your DNS server config so that you have the public IP address that I should use to get to your web server. The public IP address is going to be the IP that you statically configured on the outside of your router. So we'll need to put that in the DNS config. And then from the outside, when I go to your web server, I'll type in www.yourdomainname.whatever. I will ask my DNS server. I will have configured my DNS server to know about your DNS server at this point. It will ask your DNS server for the IP address of your web server. Your DNS server will send back to me the public IP address of your web server, and then my browser will connect to your web server going through the router using the NAT that we set up last week, network address translation. So that's pretty much what we're doing in the lab this week. There are other podcasts that go over the specifics of how to configure everything and make it work, but that's pretty much an overview.